TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the podcast where we're not yet made by an AI, so that's kind of cool. My name is Patrick.
I saw one of those.
Did you see the one about Joe Rogan?
No, but I saw it. It's a different one I watched called Trash Taste about like these guys who are in Japan, like they were big anime YouTubers. Yeah. And they had their like all their topics were generated by an AI.
Oh damn! No, what I'm talking about, like the Joe Rogan one, it's not even topic. They literally had an AI recreate his voice and create a full podcast that doesn't exist, basically.
Well,
and because like
it was all about alpha males.
I don't know, but because I didn't listen to all of it, but
Remember, folks, just like us, Joe Rogan is not an actual source of credible information. Please do not cite Joe Rogan. Please do not cite us.
At least we put our sources in the description.
Joe Rogan's source most of the time is, oh, I heard it secondhand. And then they fact check it and then they're like, oh, I was wrong. Whoops.
I heard it while I was tripping balls on DMT or whatever.
Tripping balls on D&D?
DMT. It was like some kind of drug.
D&D, not even once.
What is this, 1982?
Welcome to the Hellfire Club.
Oh, God. Anyway, welcome to the show about Canadian literature and history.
Today we're going to be talking about fire and how it was hell.
Hell yeah. I mean, as far as Canada's history goes, you're pretty close with New France. It sounded like a really shitty place to live, no matter who you are.
Oh, yeah. New France was not a great.
Yeah. So today, as evidenced by the title, we're going to be talking about something that doesn't fit within where we are in the chronology, but it's an episode that I wanted to do way back when and never got around to it. And now that it's Black History Month, I figured, why not?
We're going to be flashing back.
Yes, so to speak.
Yeah, with a little sound effect.
I'm not even going to bother putting in an actual sound. It's just going to be you with that harp sound. So we're going back to New France to talk about Marie-Joseph Angélique, who was a slave at this point, and we're going to talk about her, who was accused of burning down Montreal, or at least a section of Montreal. And this is actually probably one of the topics that you've read the most about, Matt, going into the episode, or before actually going into the episode. So
I studied this one in school. I read the play on it. I wrote a paper on it.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm.
And would you remember what class it was for? Just out of curiosity.
It was for literature in Montreal, or literature by Montreal writers or something.
Okay.
The class was 3 hours on a Wednesday night from like 8:30 to 11.
It's incredible that you even remember anything from that class.
Every class I would just walk off into the night. And like this class, it was a fall class, so it would end in winter. And so like on one of the classes, our prof took us outside and then she's like, I'm just going to read this poem by Leonard Cohen, and we're just going to walk off into the night in different directions. And then 10 people walked to the same metro station.
That awkward moment. You're like, okay, bye. Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Before we get into
it was a very surreal class.
I'm sure. Any class on a Wednesday night has to be, right? Or else you just don't survive.
I was brain dead most of that class. It was so like head empty, thoughts dispersed to the wind, get my A-, get out of here.
That's really what makes it surreal, though. But before we get into the topic, I do want to obviously thank all of the people who support us on Patreon. If you want to do so for $1 or $3 a month, you get access to bonus content, early content, including what is going to be a series of interviews that I'm going to be doing with some really interesting authors that are going to be coming up throughout the month of February and March, including some, honestly, I don't mind saying, some really heavy hitters in Canadian literature. So
we got pull now.
Yeah,
Patrick has pull. I'm his side piece.
Is there a play on words that we can make here with Canada and side hoe? I don't know.
Because Joe Rogan isn't just Joe Rogan. He has his buddies there, right? His co-hosts. Yeah. Nobody can name them. That's me. I'm the third guy on the moon.
You're the guy who fact checks, except he doesn't.
I'm your you're the talk show host, and then I'm your sidekick off to the side.
Yeah.
You're Jimmy Fallon, and I'm Higgins.
Okay.
Except we're funny.
So, shots fired.
Back to Angélique. Angélique?
So, Angélique, yeah, I would say. Except that wasn't her original name.
Of course, none of them are.
No, exactly. As we'll see, like the factuality, despite being something that we do, obviously we make jokes and all, but we do try to be as historically accurate as possible, like based on the sources. But this is one of those cases where even in the history books that we do read, they admit that's there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, right? Or that's up in the air still to this day, right? And part of that is due to the time period that this happens in, and part of that is due to the biases of the people who were performing the trials or things like that, right? There's, in this case, when we talk about history being written by the victors, for a long time, this was very clear as far as slavery was going, right? And, there's a reason why sources for this topic specifically really started emerging in the late 90s and early 2000s, like literally hundreds of years afterwards. I remember seeing when I was researching this topic that the first book to actually address slavery in New France as a historical phenomenon came out in 1960, which is unacceptable. Right?
As with many things in slavery.
Well, for sure. But it's it just goes to show that the actual wealth of sources that we have for a lot of these things has to often be either reconstructed based on minimal sources that we have, or takes time to figure out because we're still discovering sources in the archives for things like this, right? Or we have to look for sources in different places. So yeah, just I guess we could go into that with that general warning. But yeah, the way I was thinking of structuring this episode, usually we start with the history and then literature, but I was thinking of doing a sandwich in this case, where we would start with a poem, talk about the history, and then come back to the play that you talked about that you had read, right? By Lorena Gale. And the reason why I wanted to start with the poem is because it's written by the same person who wrote kind of the definitive, or at least the most complete history of this topic. So I thought it would kind of be an interesting way of introducing the topic in general. So here we go. I'm just opening it up here on my computer. So the author who wrote this poem is called Afua Cooper. And again, she's the main source that I pulled from. Her book, which came out in 2006, was called The Hanging of Angélique, The Untold Story of Canadian Slavery and the Burning of Old Montreal. It's great. If ever anyone's looking for a good introductory text to this topic, it's quite interesting. And yeah, she wrote basically a poem based on her perception of Angélique, right? And this poem was written in 1999, or at least published in 1999, so a few years before the actual history was published. Had you ever read this poem, just out of curiosity? You're muted.
No, I have not read it. I had only read it in preparation for this.
And we're not going to read all of it just because it is a little bit long on the longer side, but we could at least, I feel like the first stanza is quite interesting on its own, and we can kind of read a few of them here and there. Yeah, so I'll start with the first stanza here. It starts off quite strongly with, "I buried the twins that evening. They died of smallpox, were only 8 months old. Madame came to the funeral, and said to me by way of consolation, C'est la vie. I too have lost my own. I went back to work in Madame's house. That same evening and at supper, she yelled at me and boxed me full in the face because I overturned the gravy bowl in her lap. Already, just this introductory poem, I find it, like this introductory stanza, I find it very interesting, the contrast that Cooper is bringing up, right? This kind of false solidarity that Madame is trying to build, but it can't possibly exist just because of the power dynamic that's occurring. And we're going to develop obviously who these characters are, but I do think it's, again, just a good introductory idea here. Plus I like the way that Cooper builds this world. The kind of fact of life almost of losing a child is just kind of blatantly said both by Madame and the poem itself. Like literally just starting off of like, yep, they just died of smallpox, and that's a thing. There's just there's no vaccine obviously at the time, so it's just like the fact of death is very clear in this poem, and I feel like it's an interesting way to start that, especially considering where Angélique's life would go. Around halfway into the poem, she then goes on to say, Madame talking to her best friend and confessor, Father Labadie, I'm going to sell that negresse. She's getting too much for me. She's getting too uppity. And further, since Francois died, I just can't seem to manage too well. Perhaps the church is interested. I bring in the food and pretend like I'm never here. And I serve the food good and proper. Was on my best behavior, roll back me lip and skin me teeth, and roll back my eye and show the white. Then I went back to my room in the cellar and make me plan. Smoke, too much smoke. Only intend for one house for burn. Fire, too much fire. And it done go so already, and I running my feet unshackled, unbound, free, running past the city limits, while behind me to fire rage, and my raging heart change back into its rightful position. I don't know. Any thoughts about what I just read here, at least as far as introductory remarks go?
About the introduction of Angélique,
or just stanza? Like these stanzas that I just read. I feel like these were like the main ones that I wanted to talk about, at least as far as like introducing the topic goes.
It's how do I put my? It's interesting because when you talk about Angélique, there's actually a whole thing about this contradiction. Like at the time people talk about she was almost incompetent, right? She was almost portrayed as kind of dumb, moronic, blah blah blah. But then you read this poetry, and then you hear her story, and then they try and pin this massive prime on her, like as if she's some kind of super genius, you know?
Right. Yeah. And to me, like to add on to that point, at least, as far as perceptions, or at least what was ascribed to her as, like you were saying, not necessarily this bright woman, but still somehow of an evil genius. The use of language, right? Not necessarily quote unquote proper English, right? There are mistakes in the syntax and so on, but it's still written in a way that's beautiful thanks to the poetry, in a sense, right? So this contrast shows up in the form of the poem and the work as well. And I find that's a kind of visual representation of what you're talking about in this case, right? How she seems to the world versus like the actual structural way in which her words are either construed or built for her, in a sense. So yeah, I feel like that's that was just the way. Like the poem is available for free, by the way, on the University of Toronto Canadian Poetry Online, and we'll make it available if people want to read all of it. But
read all of it. It's very interesting.
Oh yeah, it's very good. But yeah, I just wanted to start off with that at the very least. But yeah, so you already started talking a little bit about your own, what you know of Angélique, right? Of the way that she was portrayed. But yeah, was there anything else that you wanted to mention as far as like initial thoughts or initial knowledge about her life and what happened to her that you wanted to add before we get into the meat of the history?
it's always an interesting, not interesting, but it's always something you have to remember when you're reading this, is that there's probably a large part of their history we don't know because of slavery, because of the way slavery works, and also because of the fact of how history is still perceived and recorded, and how oral tradition was so looked down upon that a lot of these people's history is lost to time just because it was thought that there was not a proper recording of it, even though oral tradition is really important.
And there's a way in which, memory does play a part, as we'll see in her trial, right? But the memory of very specific people, right? People who sometimes had never actually seen or had been in regular contact with Angélique claimed to have heard her say certain things. So, orality does play a part as insofar as like hearsay, right? Or what people remember having heard, right? Which is its own problem, of course, right? Especially when you're, acting, like you say, within a context of slavery in this case. So getting into the history a little bit more proper, by the way, as I mentioned before, Angélique is not this person's real name. It wasn't her baptized name or whatever, the name that she was given at birth. But it's the name I'm going to be using here, even before she got that name, just because it'll be easier to keep track of in this case. But Angélique was born in Portugal. We assume around 1705. But really, we know very little about the first 20 years of her life, right? She may have been enslaved in Portugal, which was an active port, obviously, of the slave trade at the time and continued to be for quite some time. And she would arrive in New England at the age of 20. And that's where we start to know a little bit more about her life as far as archival sources are concerned, right? And we know this is that she arrived there is because she was purchased by a French merchant named François Poulain de Francheville in 1725, who then brought her up to Montreal to be a domestic slave. Right? Pretty quickly, right? It would seem that Angélique would be quite objecting to the abuse that she suffered at the hands of Madame de Francheville, who's the Madame that the poem refers to in this case, who was her mistress and the husband, and the wife of François in this case. Particularly, it would seem that Madame de Francheville got quite violent after her husband had died, right? And it's at that moment that that Madame de Francheville would change Marie-Joseph's name to Angélique, right? In part, in order to create a sense of, cohesion within her mind after the death of her husband, but in part, it would seem because of the death of her own daughter, right? And that's the daughter that Madame was referring to in the poem that I read at first, right? So the loss of these two people seemed to want Madame de Francheville to kind of recreate this sense of family through Marie-Joseph by rebaptizing her Angélique. And one of the ways that I thought was very interesting that was mentioned in Afua Cooper's book, right, in which Angélique would kind of object to the abuse and would kind of perform her own sense of resistance to obviously this terrible system of slavery, is written on page 176 of the Cooper book. And I'm just going to read this out because it's not a particularly long paragraph, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Madame de Francheville refused her bondswoman's request for freedom. Infuriated, Angélique went on a small reign of terror in the household. She talked back to her owner, threatened her with death by quote-unquote roasting, quarreled with the other servants in the house, threatened them too, with burning, and made life so unbearable for her fellow servant, Marie-Louise Poirier, that she quit her job. Madame Francheville, seemingly unable to defend herself or the harassed servant, promised Poirier that she was going to sell Angélique in the spring, and then Poirier could come back to work for her. Slave woman and slave mistress declared a psychological war on each other and bided their time. Madame Francheville had the upper hand, or so she believed. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this kind of mode of resistance that's going on here.
And any other like time in history, Angélique would be a hero for resistance, for fighting back and everything. For just the fact that she was able to fight back, and the fact that this woman was not able to or did not shows a lot. That's how like her slave owner.
Yeah. So to me, this kind of shows two things, right? One, it shows it really is fascinating just how, like you're saying, just how much she was able to resist, because it does a bit fly in the face of what you hear about slavery, obviously. But also it shows very clearly that slavery was never just an accepted fact, right? There was always a resistance, right, to it, right? We don't necessarily hear about it very often, or now as social histories are becoming more and more popular, we do hear about it. But for a long time, we didn't necessarily hear about these forms of resistance. And we just assumed that, eventually the British government just outlawed slavery and that's when everything was hunky-dory. But no, there was always resistance to this institution. And this little section, I think, is very indicative of that fact. But yeah, and Cooper does a very good job in this case of bringing in sources, or at least hearsay from the time, of what, in this case, Angélique was trying to was saying, apparently, and trying to put it within its historical context. So, like, obviously, the emphasis on roasting and burning, the harassment, right? All of this is Cooper's way of kind of setting the groundwork for the eventual fire, both in the minds of the people at the time, right, who would have heard these specific words, right, and then later, as the fire happened, would have kind of associated with it, and it made it kind of easier for them to then blame Angélique, because these words would have been, possibly ones that they would have heard her say many a time, right? And they're words that you wouldn't have necessarily thought about, deconstructing, but because in the context of the fire that would pass through Montreal, that would obviously become used against her, right? Or come to be used against. Yeah. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but I just thought it's an interesting setup in this case. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's really interesting to me, like how strong that narrative of her incompetency has then created a figure that isn't as discussed or celebrated as they should be. That crime of the fire of Montreal, which she may not even have committed.
Yep. The example that's coming to mind in this case of, like, when you say she may not have committed, there's obviously, this was about 100 years prior at that point, or almost, right? But the Great Fire of London in 1666, right?
Yeah.
Fires were pretty common.
Fires happened. They could have just been a baker.
It's just like, we don't know. But yeah, fires just happened because houses were made of fucking wood and things were heated with fireplaces. Like, there was a Christmas tree that could have caught on fire. Like, things just happen, right? But it's also that's kind of what I guess we can talk about at the end. But it is always interesting to think about why it does matter whether she did it or not. Because on the one hand, it could be a crime of, it could be a way of, scapegoating a slave that was known to be rebellious. But it could also, by many historian standards, it was an act of martyrdom or resistance, right, against an oppressive system. And yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, I think in this passage that I read, you also get what you were talking about, where when Madame de Francheville wants to get the other servant back, right, Marie-Louise Poirier, she claims that she could just get rid of Angélique, but at the same time, Angélique seems to be central enough to the household that she can't get rid of her, right? And there's this like whole psychological warfare going on. So yeah, it's interesting how that plays into what you're talking about. Yeah. So in early 1734, I'm losing my words. In early 1734, going going forward with her promise, Madame de Francheville would sell Angélique to a certain François-Étienne Cugnet, or Cugnet, I guess that would be Cugnet, of Quebec City. And she would sell her for about 600 pounds of gunpowder. Fuck me why Madame de Francheville would need 600 pounds of gunpowder. Yeah. What? I get it if you're a soldier, but your husband's dead. And like, what are you going to do with 600 pounds of gunpowder?
What would anybody who's not in the military do gunpowder? And even if you're in, like a government should be ordering that much gunpowder.
Right. Like,
that sounds like enough gunpowder to start a massive fire in Montreal.
You don't say. But yeah, I've never necessarily gunpowder and shot were certainly used to place food on the table. How are they? Oh, okay. Like apparently it was also used to, yeah, obviously for protection's sake, but again, she would have had to, apparently it was a staple in colonial America, like outside of just munitions. I'm just looking this up very quickly. Shavings, so it's used in gunpowder, obviously. This is making for great content right here, just looking up gunpowder information. But yeah, apparently it was used for like all kinds of amenities. Huh. Okay. Well, maybe I guess she could use it for other things, but interesting. Anyway.
Anywho.
So yeah. So regardless of what Francheville used it for, she would sell Angélique for 600 pounds of gunpowder. And this didn't happen immediately, however, as Francheville was waiting for the ice to thaw on the St. Lawrence River in order to send Angélique by boat. And it was rumored, and this is kind of where the conflict for Angélique at least begins on a more wider scale. It was rumored that Cugnet wanted to sell her into enslavement in the West Indies, right? Where most likely she would have been working on a plantation rather than as a domestic servant, which obviously is not great to be a domestic servant or slave by any stretch, but, you know, I guess comparatively to a plantation in the West Indies is, you know, slightly better. I don't know. I don't want to make that comparison because it's slavery. It doesn't matter, right? And it's at this moment that hearing this rumor, right, that she would maybe going to be sent to the West Indies, that she tried to escape with a French Canadian servant who might have been her lover. And this man's name was Claude Thibault. And this is where, again, adding fuel to the fire, pun intended, right, of her trial, the couple would set a fire, but not the fire that would spread to the rest of Montreal, but they would set a fire to Angélique's bed in the home where Angélique was temporarily kept, right? In the home of someone called Alexis Monnière. And that fire on the bed allowed them to escape, right? In the direction of New England, where they hoped to catch a ship that was bound for Europe. So again, just adding to the long list of things that authorities would be able to use against Angélique, right, is the primary use of fire in this case. Right? It wouldn't take long, however, before the couple would be found near Chambly, actually, which is not far from here in Montreal. It's about 20 minutes away. And this was about 2 weeks later that they were both tracked down, and Angélique was returned to her owner, and Thibault was sent to jail. Right. And again, once she returned to Montreal, more and more people started to claim, or at least this would appear in the trial, right, that more and more people claimed to hear Angélique state that she was going to burn down her mistress's house, right, because she wanted freedom so much. Again, something that Cooper's book does well is kind of not necessarily engaging with the idea that she may or may not have done it, but kind of weaving in multiple perspectives that add to the uncertainty of whether or not Angélique did it. And a few weeks later, right, on the evening of Saturday, April 10th, 1734, that is where a large portion of Montreal would start to burn, right? And specifically, it was begun in the Merchants' Quarter, and that whole section was destroyed by fire. Now, for people who might be living in Montreal who have, been to Montreal and have a good sense of its geography, this would be roughly in the old port, right? Obviously, the old port was reconstructed, but it would be more or less in that vicinity near the Bonaventure Highway or something like that. That would have been the area that caught fire. And in total, because of a strong wind that was happening at that time, very similar to the blaze of London that happened in 1666, about 46 buildings were completely destroyed, right? Not just caught on fire, but straight up reduced to ashes in this case. And in part because of a desire, I think a very human desire to try to find blame in someone, but also because of everything that was going on with Angélique. She was the one who was accused of arson and put on trial. Right? Now, obviously, in the French legal system, slavery allowed her no rights, right? Because she was a slave, duh, right? But also, there was a kind of double whammy in which the accused was actually presumed to be guilty in New France and in the French legal system, and they had to prove their innocence, right? Which is kind of contrary to what we now see of innocent until proven guilty. And there were no trials by jury that were given at the time, and there was only a kind of inquisitorial tribunal in which the defendant had to kind of prove their innocence.
Because who needs a justice?
Yeah, really, right? Straight up. I saw somewhere that in the under Louis XIV, there were no lawyers that were allowed to practice in the colony at the time. So it's like you don't even have you kind of have to represent yourself in a sense, which is, for a slave, obviously freaking impossible or almost. Yeah, which I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but like as if this deck weren't stacked against her already as a slave, it just kind of like the legal system itself just seems to be completely against anyone who's accused of anything.
It's like it's made out of like butter or something.
Please develop that thought.
What, the legal system being made out of butter?
Yes, while I plug in my computer because I forgot to do that and my battery's about to die.
It's the fact that, and again, this is not like something new. This isn't something profound we're really saying right now about the legal system. It's always been a bit like this, especially in ye olden days. But it still doesn't change the fact that it still continues to this day in some ways. How you can grease the wheels of any judicial system.
Interesting.
See, I tied it back to butter.
But
also the fact that like this poor Angélique was on a slippery slope to begin with. Like there was never going to be a win for her. It was always just going to be, you were always going to lose. We're just going to make this really fast.
Absolutely. And the idea that this is going to be, something that has repercussions throughout time, I think is noteworthy in this case, right? It's not for nothing that, again, a lot of the interest in Angélique would appear in like the mid-90s, right? As, there were still racial tensions, or obviously there are still racial tensions today. That's not to say that, but, there was not long before there was the Rodney King thing that had happened in the United States, in LA. And there was, a great deal of, discussion, or at least the start of discussions about, the remnants of systemic issues that, did not allow. Yeah, exactly. That would perpetuate. Anyway, so do you know anything about the actual trial of Angélique? Do you remember anything about that in your classes?
I remember more the after, like, obviously I know that I can take a guess even at the basic ideas of the trial of Angélique being very like, I don't know, like, I didn't do this, blah, blah, and the rest were like, but didn't you really, like, very, despite lots of trumped up charges, trumped up evidence, witnesses, that sort of stuff. Like, you can already guess how this trial plays out.
Yeah. And despite this, it's kind of fascinating because it was one of the longer trials at the time, right? It would last for like 6 weeks, right? Which is quite long.
A whole 6 weeks.
Obviously, there are trials that have lasted longer, but for someone who was, again, scapegoated by many accounts, and that, again, had no really no legal rights. It would have been very easy to have this done and over with, in a matter of days, right? But nevertheless, they did seem to take the time to hear as many people as possible, I guess, to have as much evidence as possible to put this person to death. But yeah, I just find it kind of interesting that it would last for 6 weeks. Now, you're absolutely right in saying that at first Angélique just completely denied anything, just flat out no. No.
Mhm.
And according to the laws at the time, right, any witnesses or any depositions from witnesses, Angélique would have not been present for that. So she had no idea what people were saying about her, unless, she would hear about it secondhand or through other people, which of course she would not have. And this obviously hinders greatly her ability to defend herself, since she doesn't know what she has to defend herself against or what charges specifically are launched against her outside of arson, right? She couldn't necessarily counteract the claims or the validity of certain people to have seen her, right? Because she didn't know who claimed to have seen her set fire, for example. And the king's prosecutor would select a number of witnesses that he wished to confront with the accused in the hope that she would confess her crime. That would come later. And it was at that stage that Angélique would see the faces of those who had given testimony against her. But even then, she would continue to deny any charges, right? However, right, part of the legal system of the time would have required her to confess, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why it lasted so long, is because they kind of had to get a confession out of her in order to fully bring her to justice in this case, or bring the crime to justice. And that's when the kind of torture would begin, right? And I don't think it's necessary to describe the torture, because I don't see the point. It would just feel kind of reductive in a sense, or a bit, what's the term I'm looking for? Sensational in a sense. But in essence, her legs were broken or badly damaged in this during this torture process that was made to have her accept, or at least admit to her guilt. And indeed it worked, right? But then you kind of open up this whole thing of like, well, did she just say what they wanted her to hear because she knew where it was going anyway and just wanted it to be over with? Probably. I don't know. It's like anything. It's like when you hear about it in the modern day, right? When, as more and more documents are coming out about what was done in the aftermath of 9/11, right, under the Patriot Act, it's like, how valid is a lot of the information that the U.S. government got when it was, performed under torture? It's like, not really, right?
Not really.
Go ahead.
No, it's just this. This is just a larger, like, microcosm of the larger failures of the justice system. And again, not just the U.S., but also in Canada. It's just that this is the most talked about occurrence, I guess, would be the most to talk about occurrence of Angélique in the fire of Montreal, solely because she is tied to the fire. But exactly. It's almost funny, because now in retrospect, people want to say, we don't know. Like, there's a very good chance she did not.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, exactly. And just by the way, there's a great site that I pulled some information about. If anyone wants, transcripts of the actual documents or the legal documents that actually do indicate what we're talking about here, there is a transcript of the interrogation in this case that happened on June 21st, 1734 in this case. And yeah, it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to read the gory details in this case, but in the first section, she had stated to be named Marie-Joseph by her baptismal name and surnamed Angélique, aged 29 years, born in Portugal, slave of the said widow Francheville, blah, 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 interrogated as to those who assisted or advised her to set fire to the house of the said Dame Francheville stated that no one assisted her, and she did not set it at all. A reading done to her of the present interrogation, she stated that her responses contained truth and persisted on it, and declared to not know how to write or sign. And then the next section immediately, right, this is where they claim that they're going to put her, that they're going to torture her and put her to death, right, if she, in this case. And that's where they give her the tight boot, which people can look up what it is in this case as a torture method. And they admit it straight up. It's like, at first she said that the accused stated that she had no knowledge at all of any other person and that it is not her. A wedge was inserted. She said, "I want to die. It is I and no one else." With the second strike, stated that she preferred to die, that no one assisted her in setting the fire. With the third, repeated the same. And the fourth asked to be hanged, that it is her alone, right? So basically, really, as we were saying, like, this is just me reading from the transcript, but it adds on to what I was saying of the only way that she would actually admit to anything is under torture. Yeah, exactly.
There's a reason we don't accept that anymore as actual evidence.
And it is nonetheless interesting that she would never throw anyone else under the bus, right? Because you could have at that point, right? But again, at some point, you just tell people what they want to hear. Now, over 25, in total, over 24 witnesses had been called, and 23 of whom stated that they believed Angélique had set the fire because at one point or another, she had told him that she would, right? One of these,
do it.
Like, by the way, one of these witnesses was a 5-year-old girl. So, like, really scraping the bottom of the barrel here.
Well, it's, again, like, I'm just going to kill my boss one of these days. No.
It's like
hyperbole.
Also, first of all, hyperbole. Second of all, how often do you think that would have happened? Like, seriously, do you think all the slaves would have just been happy to be there? No, of course they would have all said something similar. Like we're making light of it in this case because it's freaking absurd, but like, god damn. And one witness said that she straight up saw Angélique carrying a pot of live coals up to the roof minutes before the fire started. Evidently, this witness felt no need to stop Angélique if they had seen her, but yeah, whatever.
It's also like, ancient times, who knows why she brought coals? Like, literally, like, you could probably think of a dozen reasons.
Yeah, exactly. But isn't it convenient though, right? That this black slave brought coals just before a fire. So, all the evidence is pointing there.
It's not like she could be warming up something for the house. It's not like she could be warming up her own house. Who knows, man? Right. You don't use coals for anything else. Also,
especially not in the 18th century.
Like, starting a full fire like that'd be one slow fucking fire to start.
I mean, especially on the roof. You wouldn't want to start a fire on the roof, would you?
Yeah.
Like, because then it would be hard to escape.
Yeah. Like, these people don't know how to start fires. Even before we had things like gasoline or whatever, you would want to start it with an actual live fire. Coals are hot, mind you, and you can definitely start a fire with them. But it's like, it's kind of inefficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd think. But I don't think anyone's looking for, like, profound logic here. And again, there's no one who's there to defend her aside from herself.
Yeah.
So, she's working with the information she's got. Ultimately, surprising no one, Angélique would be set to be executed in 1734, later in that same year. And after the torture, she was set to have her hands cut off and then be burned alive and then hanged. But the sentence was appealed to the Superior Court of Quebec City, where the death penalty was upheld, but the gruesome aspects, like the hand chopping, were lessened, right, or removed. After the torture part, Angélique would be dressed in white, holding a burning torch, right, in her hand, which is obviously the symbol of her crime. And she was basically placed in a garbage cart and paraded through the Notre Dame Basilica, which is still there today. And at this point, she would officially confess her crime before God and beg for forgiveness before she was put to death. As was pretty common at the time, her body was actually displayed for about 2 hours before it was actually taken down, which is terrible, obviously.
Can we stop? Like, god damn, people need to like doing shit like displaying bodies.
Right? And look, this is not new by any stretch of the imagination. Like, looking through a great deal of human history, like this was a common practice, right? Of the actual displaying of things. But that doesn't forgive it. That's who thought of that idea, really?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who thought that? I get the logic behind it of wanting to serve as a warning, but that is cruel, like, and completely unnecessary in this case, and really says more about the people who is perpetuating the system than the actual people who are putting the crime on, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right. I think that's a good intervention of like, fucking chill, dude.
Chill, folks.
So after her body had been displayed, that's when it was burned. So again, we kind of didn't touch upon the actual elements of the trial itself, or not necessarily the trial, but the documents. But I will link to the website that has all kinds of transcripts, and they're very interesting to go through. And like I was saying before at the start of the episode, these are archives that really people hadn't gone through much until the late 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Afua Cooper, who we pulled from in this particular episode, it is very interesting because she has an article that I remember reading for a class, because I also looked at Angélique and the literature surrounding her for a class. It's interesting because not long before actually writing this book and the poem, Cooper would write an article that advocated to pay more attention to Black Canadian women's history specifically, right? As something that already women's history in general is one that's often forgotten, but also, African Canadian, but specifically Black Canadian women is just something that she felt was completely dejected in history. And I tend to agree with her in this case. We hear about people like Angélique, or now we have a obviously very famous Black Canadian woman on our $10 bill, but most people couldn't tell.
Most people wouldn't know that.
No, exactly. Like, if you ask the common person who Viola Desmond is, they wouldn't necessarily know who like you're talking about and what she did. But yeah, I think it's still a very apt point, even 25 years after that article was written. And I think the case of Angélique, despite being probably one of the more popular ones to talk about, is still one that's under discussed, right? I was looking just out of curiosity at like other podcasts that had perhaps talked about it. And there's a few that were produced by the CBC, but generally it's very under discussed as far as Canadian history is concerned. And I feel like that's a shame. Like, it's a very interesting case to discuss in this case. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the theater play that you've read, and then we'll kind of, I guess, wind down. So did you have a chance to reread it? Did you have a chance to reread it in preparation for the show, or were you mostly going off of memory of the first time that you had read it?
Yeah, I was trying to find it, but then the novelization you had provided was more of a novel, so I couldn't find the play.
Okay.
Anyway, but I do remember it being an interesting read/dramatization, especially choosing to do a play.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you're more of the theater buff than I am. Like, why do you think the play is interesting in this case?
Well, it's more just the fact of why a play. Even tragedies that we know of, they're very. This seems like a very early example of based on historical events.
Right. I mean, Shakespeare would write on historical events.
Yes, for sure. But again, those would be events very much steeped in the past, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's very much this belief that the events are like there's a knowledge that there's gonna be taken a mythologization to it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're gonna make this is much more like we're gonna talk about something. Because when was the play released again?
98 originally.
Yeah, okay. 1998 or 1798?
Yep. No, 1998. So it was written by Lorena Gale, by the way. I mentioned this before, but I just want to mention it again. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that's happening 200 or so years later.
Absolutely, 250.
Yeah, 250. There we go. It's very interesting to see play as a choice, especially since a lot of the similar instances we've seen up to this point have been novelizations, or like 1998 biographic films would have been a thing.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of other options, especially when we consider what plays are usually linked to are more things of personal dramas. Like you don't see a lot of biographical plays.
Right. Especially not of this subject matter. Like I don't feel like this is the type of thing that, at least here in Canada, that you see that much of.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, just in general, the story is not. It also just doesn't seem like a story made for a play, really.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's like part of. I guess the actual.
Like I'm just wondering how the translation. Because I'm trying to remember from my own memory the translation of this.
That's the thing. Lorena Gale did use the transcripts of the trial to kind of piece together to piece together a theater play, like you were saying. So the scope of the play is not as wide-ranging as what we were talking about today, right? It doesn't start necessarily with Angélique's arrival, but the kind of crux of the play in this case, or the how can I say, the main action, I guess, is the sense of freedom that Angélique wants to achieve, right? Mm-hmm. And I noted down specifically page 58, right, that I feel there's a piece of dialogue that Angélique says that I feel just kind of captures what we're talking about here, or what the crux of the play is. And this is just before the fire starts. How long can I wait? Each minute brings me closer to a living death. And I'm alive. I am alive. His touches burn, sear, scorch, igniting fire deep inside where pain and ice had been, and I feel heat, life, force, power, black and strong. She envies that, cold, passionless bitch, just like her bastard husband, both sucking life, denying life. No, I am not a chair, a sack of grain, or a calf to be fattened and sold for slaughter. I am alive and loved, and I can't wait any longer. And the stage direction here mentions smoke begins to fill the stage as various characters start screaming fire. It is kind of interesting, at least Gale seems to be pointing towards the fact that that Angélique did set the fire in this case, but at the same time, it's not exactly clear from the play. Right? Because the fire just begins, right? She just has this monologue and the smoke begins to fill the stage. There's no stage direction that says that Angélique does set the fire, right? So in a sense, she is kind of, or at least the way I read this play, it felt like Angélique was channeling something almost, or channeling like they were making power of change. Yeah.
Or at least the author was channeling that through Angélique.
Yes, exactly.
Plays, much like television shows, are very much things for authors and scriptwriters to channel through. You know, it's very much a medium for the writer more than it is for anybody else. The actor, the directors, etc. They all have their places and their pieces for sure, and most directors will at least in some way be involved with it. But unlike films, which are very much like a director's medium, plays are very much like you are channeling the writing.
That's interesting. I'm curious, like, why do you think that is? This is perhaps more of like a comment less on this particular play and more on theater in general, but I'm curious.
Yeah, it's more a comment on theater in general.
Yeah.
It's more a comment on, like, take, for example, any production of Shakespeare. No matter how the director might try and reframe the story, it's still going to be the words.
Yeah, okay.
No matter... Like now, especially with this this is where it gets really interesting with an adaptation, especially of something that actually happened.
Yeah.
So now we have the story of Angélique translated for a play, channeled through this author. There's 3 levels of removal of the simulacra right now. Simulacra.
We're at like stage 3.
Yeah, we're like, honestly, we are like, we're at stage.
Yeah.
Now it's even worse. We have the event, we have the transcripts, and then we have the adaptation of the transcripts into a play.
Right. So, by the way, what Mac is referring to is something that a philosopher called Jean Baudrillard mentioned as like successive phases of an image, right? In which phase 1 is that the image is a reflection of basic reality. Phase 2 is that it masks and slightly perverts basic reality. And stage 3 is that it masks the absence of a basic reality, right?
Yeah, so
whereas stage 4
right now.
Right. But stage 4 is that there's no bearing to reality whatsoever.
Essentially, the idea is the more times you redo, or like the more times you do an image of something, the less of itself there is within the image, or the less of itself there is within the product.
Right. Although
the more you
it's
adapt
interesting,
something, the more it becomes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like Gail would have been closer to number 2, or at least she was trying to go closer to number 2. And like, yes, it would alter basic reality in the use of like anachronistic language, because obviously calling someone a
and I'm not saying
cold bitch is not like something that you'd hear in the 1730s, but
I'm not saying it's good. Like, I'm saying like this is what has happened though. We are 3 stages in of a translation and adaptation, because again, this is not Gail's fault. The fault does not lie with stage 3. It lies with stage 2, because again, the records from that time were faulty at best. So, and as much as she would want to piece together and use the original image, if we're going to continue with the metaphor of the philosophical, she can't. She has to rely on stage 2 to create her thing.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Okay, I didn't get that when you were talking, but yeah, okay, I can get behind that. Yeah.
Like, it's not a failure on her part at all. It's a failure of what preceded her.
Absolutely.
Because again, the oral accounts that were important to other cultures, say from like that might have helped along, were not recognized by Western Eurocentric.
Right. At the same time, like I feel like
so like if we get a movie adaptation of that play, we would be at stage 4. My favorite reference of that is the meme of Orson Welles, because Orson Welles, like, he was in a recording booth, right?
Yeah.
And he says like, oh, you can't make me say this, you have to blow me, because like the grammar was just so bad. And it's something that got parodied, and eventually it was like parodied in an episode of Animaniacs. It was wild. But that's just to demonstrate the idea of what we're getting in this play is it's an illusion of an illusion.
And I feel your point of saying that it's not a problem necessarily is well taken, because it does allow Gail to make more of a comment on the legacy of this play than perhaps.
And again, even Gail can use that to her advantage and say, I know this is wrong, therefore I can satire it. I can poke fun at it. I can use it for these different reasons.
Yeah, and like use. I saw a criticism of a critique, I should say, not a criticism of the play that says that it presents Angélique more as a rebel than as a martyr figure, right? Which the line of which can be thin.
Yeah,
between
it's
the
also
two.
We have to look at Angélique's motivations. Like, she wasn't trying to start a movement; she was just trying to get away from this horrible life.
And like as evidenced by the passage that I put, she's like, I just want to live.
Yeah, as evidenced by her poem.
Exactly.
She's not trying to start a rebellion. She's just one of millions that doesn't want to be a slave.
There you go. Shocking, right?
The only reason her story is known more is because of the fact of this trial and this fire.
Right. Exactly. It was such at the time, I guess it would have been a media sensation, right? Which, by the way, brings me to another
gossip in New France.
Right. But for a while it was, right? It did actually lead to quite a bit of a scandal, which, by the way, again, another critique that I saw, and because it's not one that I'm well versed in, I can't like engage much with the critique, but I do want to bring it up considering this. There's been some people that have drawn parallels between Gail's adaptation of the Angélique trial, Marie-Joseph Angélique trial, sorry, I should say, with the O.J. Simpson trial that would have happened not long before the actual play, right? not insofar as like Gail is claiming that Simpson was innocent or anything like that, right? But the way that people caused such a media sensation around a Black criminal um, created some interesting parallels, at least in Gail's mind, and the way that the play was formulated and the time in which it was created, right?
Yeah, I
And
doubt there is less like a super deep intention and more just the fact that like this is gonna bleed in no matter what you.
right. And to create an obvious parallel, especially with the idea of Blackness and the way that Black bodies are constructed, right? Especially in North America and within the context of slavery, right? One can look at the way that when O.J. Simpson was put on the cover of Time magazine, right? I think it was Time magazine, he was darkened. His skin was deliberately darkened in the picture, right? Which I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Oh, I've heard of it. I've seen.
Right, which is wild, right? Obviously, but it does feed into, again, what we're talking about in this case of the constructions or the way that Black people, especially in North America, but across the world, really, were kind of constructed in order to, put more emphasis on certain aspects of them as they were criminalized, right? And, it's that kind of parallel that you can see with the Simpson trial. Along with like the potential failures of the justice system. Both
if the glove does not fit, you must acquit.
But just in the way, like, okay, this is not.
I saw her carry the coals to the roof.
But like, not just that, like the hearsay. But again, I'm not an expert on this, the O.J. Simpson trial, but I'm piecing together based on what I know is like the actual cops didn't do that good of a job of actually investigating that trial.
The media storm, the everything else around, like it was a shit show, start to beginning.
Exactly. So I think that's the kind of parallel that people are drawing in this case.
And again, if you want to draw that parallel, that's the most recent, but exactly. It's a reverse situation where the trial was done badly on purpose. The Simpson trial, I can see the parallels for sure, but to me they seem very surface level and shallow. It's more just like, we want to connect this play to a big event, so that way we can like drum up some noise about it.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. But it does feed into, nonetheless, the kind of systemic issues. I feel like there is something there, right, to the legacy of those systemic issues. But I agree, like the specific one to the OJ is a bit surface level, but I did want to bring it up just because it was something that was brought up by many critics at the time that I do feel is kind of worth at least engaging with.
Oh, for sure.
I want to finish off, unless you had anything to say about the play, the more of the play specifically, but I wanted to finish off with a question in this case, because we kind of alluded to this, of the question of her guilt. Why do you think it matters in this case? Like 300 years later, in this case, I'm curious, like what you see it as mattering, or how you see it as mattering.
Sorry, repeat the question. Sorry.
No, just answer based on what you think I said. We're going to create a simulation of the question.
I mean, if we're going to talk about what matters, because that's the word I heard the most about this play.
Okay, you can talk about the play in this case, but I just meant like, why do you think her guilt matters? Like the question of whether she's guilty or not. Why do you think it matters so far removed from the actual event?
You know what? It only matters. This is the part where I have to make it clear. Like, this is who I am. I am my white boy from Montreal. It only matters to white people. It only matters, like that question of guilt or not matters to white people only, because in that way of thinking, if she was guilty, everything is justified.
Right. Yes.
It doesn't matter to people who are not white because her treatment was shit. It's again, like, you want to paint these ways like, if she's guilty, then it's fine. What we did was the law. It's like, no, you still have to give due process. You still have to.
It was due process at the time. That would have been the equivalent of due process, right?
Yeah,
which is
context. You have to put the event in context.
Yeah, it's like
there's no context that justifies, like, what was it? Torture, execution, and then burning her body on display
after having been displayed. Yeah. Like, no, there's no context that justifies that. You're right.
That's inhumane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is if somebody had suggested doing that to a white person, it would not have flown.
I mean, it was done to people of all kinds, but yes, at the time, it was more acceptable.
Exactly. Like if for her, they would have cheered. If it was a white woman, they would have looked away because it was such a sad sight, a sad but necessary sight of justice.
Right. Yeah. I can see what you mean. And like in this case, ultimately, it's a question of historical posterity, I guess, whether or not she did it. But it's interesting. And we kind of alluded to this. I do find it interesting that whether she, is guilty or not is really a question that nobody can answer just based off of the historical evidence that's available to us. The question will remain kind of open-ended. But it always depends on what exactly the perspective is you want to take. Do you want to see her as a victim of scapegoating, right? Or, as you were saying, right, some kind of way of justifying cruel action? But it's also been reinterpreted, and this is mostly the stance that Cooper would take, right, is one of resistance to an oppressive system, right? That despite what she went through, she still didn't throw other people under the bus and claimed the crime for herself in the name of her own freedom, right? Because it's what was right. Regardless, right, of whether or not she's guilty, it is kind of cool that she's gone down in history as one of the first, if not, depending on who you ask, the first example of, in North America, right, of a slave to have kind of revolted so actively against her own status as a slave.
Oh, for sure. The fact that she isn't seen
cool.
as more of a resistance figure is kind of a shame.
Yeah. I think it's indicative. I don't think it's an accident.
I also think it's indicative of just how much people have been, like, confused, talked about, like, how simulacra her story is.
Okay.
Because you have this original tale of this, again, as we understand it now, a woman who is trying to fight back against the mistress of her household, the madame of her household, That is the basic story that we have here. And then again, eventually she says, I want to leave. Like, this is the story as we know it. Extrapolated, we have rebellions, we have the breaking of justice, we have the this, we have the that. Like, there's a lot that's been extrapolated and added onto from every aisle. Like, this has been like every side, every party has been putting their part into the creation of the knot of Angélique, the knot of the story almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah. I don't know if I have anything to kind of add on to that.
I know. Like, I know I'm not saying much, and I know what I'm probably saying is more just like not saying anything at all. But
I don't know how to end there. It's just like, yep,
I just think it's a fascinating thing that people really need to consider about these stories that we hear, especially when we try and listen to these, because we think to ourselves, oh, this story happened within the last 200-300 years. We have records, we have information of some kind. Like, we're getting better at that. Even the last 20-30 years. No, we're not. Like, yeah, we have more information, but all the new information that we get complicates the story, which I'm fine with a complicated narrative. I think it's good to have a complex narrative.
I agree.
But it means that you have to be able to learn how to critically think for yourself and how you can peel back the layers on the onion, as it were.
Like an ogre.
It's like a glass onion. But I think that's what really sits at the heart of Angélique, and why it's always going to be such this important story in the history of Canada, is just because it is such an interesting and good example case of how stories can have messages, themes, whatever else put onto them and all be viable. Because we don't know. Maybe Angélique was some kind of rebel figure. Maybe she was a martyr figure. Maybe she was just vindictive. Who knows? Like, maybe she was.
Maybe the answer is all of the above.
Maybe it is all of the above. So I think it's really an important thing when people listen to this episode, or if they decide to look into it themselves, keep an open mind, I guess, would be the final thought and message of this episode.
Yeah.
Make sure you Because again, we're dealing with a lot of these stories, and a lot we deal with today are stage 4 simulacra.
I love that so much that you brought in.
It is though, like that's what we deal with.
I know. That's why I love it. It's like I wasn't expecting it.
Any biographical piece of entertainment is already a stage 3 or 4 because they are getting their based on to remove Angélique and give you another example that you can, and this is why I love doing the show, because we can provide you ways to use this information to apply it to everyday things. And I think that's really interesting. And another one you can do it to that's a bit different, but still very real, is Alexander Hamilton.
Oh my God, yeah. Okay, that's pure stage 4.
Yeah, we are pure stage 4 with that musical, right? Because he got his information from, a biography?
I think so, yeah.
That would have been written after the fact, that would have been gotten from information from the time, which would have been recorded from the actual story of Alexander Hamilton. And as you can see, I've talked to plenty of people, like Patrick, you're a historian, I've talked to people who study history, and they're all like, damn, that play, it brought interest into the time period and made it interesting to listen to, but God, it just takes historical facts for a joyride.
And that's fine. At least you get to see Alexander Hamilton rapping.
Yeah, it's fine. I love that play. I love the music in the play. It's a great musical. Lin-Manuel Miranda did a great job with it. But you still have to have the ability to understand that this is a product of a product of a product of a product.
Yes.
Exactly. We are 4 generations removed from the original thing right now. We are 4 illusions into this, And this is, you have to have that kind of ability and awareness to do so. Right. Especially the more and more that we get, the more Netflix documentaries, the more biographical movies, the more based on historical events musicals that we get, Mm-hmm. These are all going to be illusions of illusions. And it's not even about looking for bias. That's definitely part of it, but it's just understanding the fact that you lose things in translation. If you take a phrase in English, translate it to Spanish, translate it to Russian, translate it to Japanese, you're going to have a very different phrase by the end of the day.
Good.
Which is great. These are all good things. It's just about understanding what it is to understand how we got there and how we can go back and understand the process. Absolutely. It's like the fact we have people who like Batman, I'm sure, right? Well, so you have the original comics for Batman that then get translated into something like an animated series. And then you have the people who watch the animated series and go, I want to make a movie about Batman. We're 3 levels deep, and now we have 3 very different Batmen running around.
As a kind of way of summing up what you just said, I do want to come back to Afua Cooper's poem and read the last lines, because I think it does kind of sum up what you're saying in a sense.
While also being relative to the actual episode.
Yes. Not that Batman isn't fun to talk about, but I break down. My body crumple in a heap, and before my eyes I see the twins. And they look so alive, as if they waiting for me to come nurse them. The sentence is reduced. Now I am to be hanged only, and my body burned. Father Labadie come back for the confession. And I confess. Is I Marie who set the fire? I say yes. I started in Madame's house by the river, 50 building destroyed, the hospital, the cathedral. I confess. Is I Marie who burned this city? So write that down, Father Labadie. Write down my story so it can be known in history. With my heart burning, I take the sacrament and accept the final rites. Outside, the guard is waiting to take me to the hangman's noose. Soon I will be free from the prison of this island, and I will fly and fly and fly. I think it's very interesting that she mentions, right? So write that down, right?
Yeah.
For posterity in this case. And the kind of crossing over between life and death of seeing the twins and things like that.
Almost just the fact that she wants to confess just to get it over with. She just wants freedom at this point. Freedom from life, freedom from persecution. She just wants it out.
Right. I think that's a good place to stop.
She wants to get out.
Heyo. So, Mac, how can people help the show grow and support the show and all that fun stuff?
Well, if you want to see an imitation of this show, head on over to Patreon.
Stage 4 of Patreon,
and listen to Pop Canada, where we talk even more about the simulacra representations of Canadian pop culture.
God damn. I feel like that would
Or-
be an episode in of itself. Just Samuel all the time.
Well, we did when we talk about how Canada is represented in pop culture in other nations. That requires
true.
people looking at the image that Canada presents of itself.
It's true.
So The Simpsons have already done stage 3 Canada representation.
We did stage 4.
Yeah, well, isn't that part of it? Anyway, back to important stuff. Other ways you can support the show include telling your friends, refer a friend, leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere that you listen to us. Send us a message. We always love hearing feedback. Share us on your social medias. Follow us on social media. We always love that kind of stuff. And just, I don't know, let us know. Let us know what you think of the show. Let us know what you think of us. Do you like it when we go on really dumb tangents? Do you like it when we don't? Patrick can try and corral me more. That's fine. I'm okay.
No, I refuse to corral you.
I will
You're
be chained.
uncorrallable.
I'm okay. Oh, no, I should say that in this episode. You can also use our affiliate links. You can...
Sure.
But yeah, those are the main ones. The main ones,
I
if you're
think that's
looking for
pretty much it.
anything, are word of mouth, Patreon, affiliate links, leave a review.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, this show is entirely free. We will always make it free because this is a hobby for us and we like doing it.
Cheers. See y'all next time.
Bye.